June 22nd, 1941. The border between occupied Poland and the Soviet Union. Oberst Hermann von Schlieffen stood in the turret of his Panzer III, scanning the eastern horizon through Zeiss binoculars as the first rays of dawn illuminated a landscape that would soon be consumed by the largest invasion in human history. Operation Barbarossa, the code name for Germany's assault on the Soviet Union, was minutes from commencement. 3 million German soldiers, 3,600 tanks, 7,400 artillery pieces, and 2,700 aircraft were poised to strike across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Von Schlieffen, a veteran of the French campaign where German panzers had swept aside Allied resistance in 6 weeks, felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and confidence that preceded combat. The Panzer III he commanded was a proven weapon, its 5-centimetre gun adequate against anything the Soviets possessed, its armour sufficient to deflect most anti-tank rounds, its mechanical reliability superior to any tank in the world. Intelligence briefings had been dismissive of Soviet armour capabilities. Obsolete designs, poorly trained crews, primitive tactics. The campaign was expected to last 8 to 10 weeks. Moscow would fall before winter. The Soviet Union would collapse like a rotten structure, in Stalin's own words about Finland, when kicked hard enough. What von Schlieffen did not know, what German intelligence had catastrophically failed to discover, was that scattered among the obsolete Soviet armour were approximately 200 T-34 medium tanks, a design so revolutionary that it would render every German tank obsolete overnight and force a complete rethinking of armoured warfare doctrine. Within hours, German tankers would encounter this machine and discover that their 5-centimetre guns were inadequate, their armour was insufficient, and their technological superiority was an illusion. This is the story of how German mockery turned to terror, how a single tank design changed the course of the war, and how Soviet engineers created a weapon that combined simplicity, survivability, and firepower in proportions the Germans could neither match nor counter. The Panzer III at 600 hours on June 22, 1941, represented the cutting edge of German armoured warfare. At 22 tons combat loaded, powered by a 300 horsepower Maybach engine, armed with a 50mm K38 gun, protected by 30 to 50mm of face-hardened armour, it was a formidable fighting vehicle. German tankers had used it to devastating effect in Poland, France and the Balkans. Its gun could penetrate any Allied tank at normal combat ranges. Its armour could withstand most anti-tank weapons. Its mechanical reliability allowed sustained operations that overwhelmed enemies through mobility and tempo. Von Schlieffen had commanded Panzer IIIs through the French campaign, had personally destroyed 12 Allied tanks, had received the Iron Cross First Class for actions at Sedan. He knew his machine, intimately, trusted its capabilities completely, believed without question in German technical superiority. The invasion began at 315 hours with the largest artillery barrage in history to that date. 3 hours later, German armoured spearheads crossed the frontier, racing east to encircle Soviet forces before they could retreat into Russia's vast interior. The Soviet response was chaotic and confused. Units were caught unprepared, communications were disrupted, command structures collapsed under the surprise attack. German panzer divisions advanced 50 kilometres the first day, 100 kilometres the second, encountering resistance that was fierce but disorganised. Soviet tanks appeared, mostly obsolete BT series and T-26 light tanks, designs from the 1930s with thin armour and weak guns. German tank crews destroyed them systematically, chalking up kills, radioing exaggerated claims, confirming every prejudice about Soviet inferiority. Then, on June 23rd, near the Lithuanian town of Raseiniai, elements of the 1st Panzer Division encountered something different. Hauptmann Wilhelm Ritter, commanding a company of Panzer IIIs, spotted movement in a tree line 800 metres distant. 5 tanks emerged, moving at speed across open ground, heading directly toward the German position. Ritter studied them through his optics, noting unusual features. Sloped armour, very thick. Wide tracks. A long-barreled gun, 76mm by his estimation. The silhouette was unfamiliar, not matching any Soviet tank in German intelligence files. Ritter ordered his platoons to engage at 700 metres, standard practice for the Panzer III's 50mm gun. 6 Panzerthursties fired simultaneously. Ritter watched the armor-piercing rounds strike the lead Soviet tank, expecting to see the familiar flash of penetration, the smoke and fire of internal explosion. Instead, the rounds ricocheted off the sloped armor, sparking harmlessly into the air. The Soviet tanks continued advancing, apparently undamaged. Ritter radioed for his gunner to fire again. Closer range, better angle. The second shot struck the turret face, another ricochet. The Soviet tank was now at 500 meters, still advancing, its gun traversing toward the German position. Ritter felt the first stirrings of fear, an unfamiliar sensation for a veteran who had faced Polish and French armor without concern. The Soviet tank fired. The 76mm round struck Ritter's platoon sergeant's Panzer III at 400 meters, punching through the frontal armor as if it were cardboard, detonating the ammunition storage. The tank exploded, turret lifting off the hull in a gout of flame, 3 crew members killed instantly, the driver and radio operator burning to death in seconds. The other Soviet tanks opened fire. At 300 meters, the 76mm gun was devastatingly effective. 4 more Panzer IIIs were destroyed in rapid succession, each penetration catastrophic, each hit resulting in immediate kill. Ritter ordered retreat, his remaining tanks reversing frantically, seeking cover in a depression that offered hull-down protection. The Soviet tanks pressed the attack, closing to point-blank range, accepting hits that did no damage, destroying German tanks that could not hurt them in return. Ritter's company lost 9 of 12 Panzer IIIs in that engagement. He survived because an 88mm anti-aircraft gun, emplaced for air defense, was hastily traversed to engage ground targets. The 88's high-velocity rounds could penetrate the Soviet tank's armor, though even then it required multiple hits and careful shot placement. 3 Soviet tanks were destroyed, 2 escaped. Ritter, evacuated to a field hospital with burns and shrapnel wounds, filed a combat report that his superiors initially dismissed as battle shock and exaggeration. Soviet tanks did not have impenetrable armor. Soviet guns did not penetrate German armor at 400 meters. The intelligence assessments were clear. This report contradicted everything known about Soviet capabilities. Similar encounters occurred across the front during the first week of Barbarossa. At Brody Dubno, the largest tank battle of the early campaign, German tankers reported Soviet medium tanks that shrugged off direct hits and destroyed panzers from ranges previously thought safe. At Minsk, an entire German panzer company was ambushed by 5 Soviet tanks that appeared from concealment, destroyed 7 German vehicles in minutes, then withdrew before heavier weapons could be brought to bear. The reports accumulated, each describing the same phenomenon. A Soviet medium tank, approximately 26 tons, armed with a 76mm gun, protected by heavily sloped armor that deflected German anti-tank rounds, capable of destroying any German tank in the inventory. German intelligence finally identified the vehicle in early July. The T-34 model, 1940, a medium tank that had entered Soviet service in small numbers before the war, undetected by German reconnaissance because it was dispersed among units rather than concentrated. The designation meant nothing to German commanders. What mattered were the capabilities. The T-34's 76mm F-34 gun could penetrate 60mm of armor at 1,000 meters, making it lethal to every German tank at normal combat ranges. Its frontal armor, 45mm thick but sloped at 60 degrees from vertical, provided protection equivalent to 90mm of vertical armor, making it impervious to the Panzer III's 50mm gun and challenging even for the Panzer IV's 75mm gun-firing standard ammunition. Its Christie suspension and 500 horsepower V2 diesel engine gave it excellent mobility across country, matching or exceeding German tanks in speed while providing better ground pressure distribution across wider tracks. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armoured warfare doctrine, encountered T-34s personally in October 1941 near Mtsensk. His 4th Panzer Division, spearhead of army, group centre's drive on Moscow, was ambushed by approximately 40 T-34s from the 4th Tank Brigade. The Soviet tanks attacked from concealed positions at dawn, catching German panzer columns on a road march, exploiting surprise and superior firepower to devastating effect. Guderian's division lost 24 tanks destroyed and 16 damaged in a single engagement, forced to withdraw and regroup, the first time a German panzer division had been tactically defeated by Soviet armor, Guderian immediately filed reports to Army High Command emphasizing the T-34's superiority and recommending urgent development of countermeasures. His assessment was brutally honest. The T-34 is the best tank in the world. German armour is technologically inferior, current tactics are inadequate, new weapons and new doctrine are urgently required. The German reaction to the T-34 evolved through 3 phases: disbelief, panic, and grudging respect mixed with determination to match its capabilities. The disbelief phase lasted through summer 1941, as frontline reports of invulnerable Soviet tanks were dismissed by rear echelon officers who had never seen a T-34, who trusted intelligence assessments over combat experience, who refused to believe that Soviet industry could produce anything superior to German engineering. This phase ended when enough senior officers, including Guderian, personally encountered T-34s and confirmed their capabilities. The panic phase lasted through late 1941 and early 1942, as German forces realized that they lacked effective counters to the T-34, that standard anti-tank weapons were inadequate, that the technological superiority assumed before Barbarossa was fiction. This phase generated urgent development programs, crash efforts to field new guns and new tanks that could match Soviet capabilities. The T-34's design was revolutionary in ways that German engineers had not anticipated. While German tank design philosophy emphasized engineering perfection, precise manufacturing, complex systems optimized for maximum performance, the T-34 represented a completely different approach. Functional sufficiency, mass production, battlefield survivability, ease of maintenance. Soviet engineers, led by Mikhail Koshkin at the Kharkov Locomotive Factory, had created a tank that was good enough in all critical parameters while being vastly easier to produce and maintain than German equivalents. The sloped armour was not new in concept. Earlier designs had experimented with angling, but the T-34 implemented it consistently across the entire hull and turret, maximising protection while minimising weight. The wide tracks, 48 cm compared to 36 cm on German tanks, reduced ground pressure from 0.8 kg per square centimetre to 0.6, improving mobility in mud and snow that dominated Soviet terrain. The Christie suspension, adapted from an American design the US Army had rejected, provided excellent cross-country speed while being simpler and more robust than German torsion bar systems. Most revolutionary was the diesel engine. German tanks used gasoline engines, more powerful per litre, but vulnerable to fire and requiring high-octane fuel that was difficult to produce and transport. The T-34's V2 diesel was adapted from aircraft engines, producing 500 horsepower from 38.8 litres, less power density than German engines, but far less flammable and capable of running on almost any diesel fuel, including crude oil in emergencies. The diesel gave the T-34 operational range of 400 kilometres, nearly double the Panzer III's 165 kilometres, crucial advantage in the vast Soviet theatre where logistics determined operational tempo. The engine was loud, 90 decibels in the crew compartment compared to 75 in German tanks, and it filled the interior with fumes. Soviet crews learned to operate with open hatches when possible, accepting the vulnerability to increase ventilation. The 76mm F-34 gun was a revelation in firepower. German tank guns in 1941 were optimized for engaging armour at medium ranges, 500 to 1,000 metres. The F-34 could engage effectively at 500 metres, outranging German tanks, allowing T-34s to destroy targets before they could respond. The gun fired a 6.3 kilogram armour-piercing round at 662 metres per second, generating 1,380 kilojoules of kinetic energy, sufficient to penetrate 69mm of vertical armour at 1,000 metres. Against sloped armour, the penetration decreased, but German tanks had mostly vertical armour, making them vulnerable across the frontal arc. The gun could also fire high explosive rounds, making it effective against soft targets, anti-tank guns, and fortifications. This dual-purpose capability gave T-34 commanders flexibility that German tankers lacked, their specialised anti-tank guns being less effective against infantry and fortifications. But the T-34 was not perfect. Its greatest weakness was the two-man turret, commander and gunner only, without a dedicated loader. This forced the commander to load the main gun while simultaneously observing the battlefield, directing the driver, communicating with other tanks and making tactical decisions. The workload was overwhelming, degrading combat effectiveness, particularly in fluid engagements where rapid target acquisition mattered. German tanks used three-man turrets, commander, gunner and loader, allowing the commander to focus on tactics while the loader maintained fire rate. This organisational advantage partially offset the T-34's technical superiority. German tanks could acquire and engage targets faster, could maintain situational awareness better, could coordinate more effectively. The T-34's combat effectiveness depended heavily on crew quality. Well-trained crews exploited its capabilities brilliantly. Poorly trained crews negated its advantages through incompetence. Soviet crew training in 1941 was abysmal. The Red Army's tank corps had been gutted during Stalin's purges of 1937-38. Experienced officers and trainers executed or imprisoned on fabricated charges, leaving a leadership vacuum filled by politically reliable but professionally incompetent replacements. When war began, many T-34 crews had fewer than 10 hours of training in their vehicles. Some had never fired the main gun. Few understood basic tactics or maintenance procedures. This inexperience manifested in catastrophic ways. T-34s attacking without infantry support, vulnerable to German anti-tank guns. T-34s bunching together, allowing German tanks to engage multiple targets. T-34s running out of fuel or breaking down from neglect, abandoned by crews who lacked mechanical knowledge. The German advance in 1941 captured or destroyed thousands of Soviet tanks, many T-34s among them, not through combat superiority, but through Soviet tactical incompetence and logistical collapse. Yet even poorly employed, the T-34 was a problem the Germans could not ignore. The standard German response when encountering T-34s was to call for 88mm anti-aircraft guns, the only weapons guaranteed to penetrate at normal ranges. The 88 had been designed for air defence, its high-velocity round optimised for engaging aircraft, but it proved devastatingly effective against armour. At 1,000 metres, the 88 could penetrate 100mm of armour, sufficient to defeat any Soviet tank including the T-34. But 88s were scarce, employed primarily in anti-aircraft role, difficult to reposition quickly, vulnerable to artillery and air attack when placed in direct fire mode. Relying on 88s was a tactical expedient, not a solution. The German armour industry responded with crash development programs. The Panzer IV, originally designed as an infantry support tank, with a short-barreled 75mm gun, optimised for high explosive shells, was upgunned with a long-barreled 75mm Kiekersvadust 40 gun, capable of penetrating the T-34's armour at normal combat ranges. The Panzer IV F2 variant, entering service in spring 1942, restored German confidence. Its gun could penetrate 89mm of vertical armour at 1,000 metres, adequate against the T-34's frontal armour if the shot hit perpendicular to the slope. Against the T-34's side armour, only 45mm thick and less steeply sloped, the Kubkirch 40 was lethal at any combat range. German tactics evolved to emphasise flanking attacks, coordinated movements to expose T-34 sides, concentration of fire from multiple tanks to overwhelm individual targets. More ambitiously, German designers began work on entirely new tank designs, specifically to counter the T-34. The Panther medium tank, designated Panzerkampfwagen V, borrowed heavily from T-34 concepts: sloped armour, powerful gun, emphasis on mobility. When it entered service in 1943, the Panther would be Germany's answer to the T-34, a tank that matched Soviet firepower and protection while incorporating German engineering sophistication. But development and production took time during which the T-34 dominated battlefields and inflicted casualties the Germans could not afford. The psychological impact of the T-34 on German tankers was profound and lasting. Before Barbarossa, German panzer crews had operated with absolute confidence in their technical superiority. They had destroyed Polish, French and British tanks with casual ease, establishing a psychological dominance that was as important as tactical skill. The T-34 shattered that confidence. For the first time, German tankers faced an opponent that was technically superior, that could destroy their tanks before they could respond, that forced defensive thinking and cautious tactics. The change manifested in subtle ways: increased spacing between tanks to avoid multiple losses, reluctance to advance without infantry and anti-tank gun support, preference for defensive positions over mobile operations. German armour, designed for aggressive breakthrough operations, was being forced into defensive roles for which it was not optimised. Soviet production of T-34s accelerated dramatically after Barbarossa began. The Kharkov Locomotive Factory, the original production site, was evacuated east ahead of German advance in October 1941. Disassembled and moved 500 kilometers to the Urals, rebuilt in Nizhny Tagil, resuming production within 12 weeks. This feat of industrial mobilization was unprecedented, an entire tank factory relocated and operational in 3 months, while simultaneously other facilities in Stalingrad, Gorky, and Chelyabinsk ramped up T-34 production. By late 1942, Soviet industry was producing approximately 1,300 T-34s monthly, more tanks than Germany produced across all types. The Soviets were implementing mass production techniques borrowed from American industry: standardized components, modular assembly, unskilled labor trained for specific tasks. The T-34 design had been optimized for this approach, minimizing complex machining, using welded armor rather than more difficult interlocked plates, accepting cruder finish in favor of quantity. The quality of early Soviet production was abysmal by German standards. Armor welds were crude, sometimes cracking under stress. Transmissions failed frequently, gears manufactured with inadequate tolerances. Optics were poor quality, limiting visibility and target acquisition. Paint was applied unevenly when applied at all. Many tanks left the factory in bare metal with only minimal rust protection. German engineers examining captured T-34s were simultaneously impressed by the design and appalled by the execution. The tank was brilliant in concept, terrible in detail, exactly backward from German practice, which emphasized engineering perfection in every component. Yet the Soviet approach worked because imperfect tanks in quantity proved more valuable than perfect tanks in scarcity. The T-34's combat record in 1941 was mixed. When employed properly by experienced crews, it was devastating. At the Battle of Leningrad's approaches, T-34s of the 1st Tank Division stopped German advances, destroyed numerous Panzers, forced tactical withdrawals. At Moscow's gates in December 1941, T-34s spearheaded Soviet counteroffensives, their mobility in snow giving them decisive advantages over German tanks whose narrower tracks bogged down. But these successes were exceptions. More commonly, T-34s were squandered through incompetent employment, sent into battle without reconnaissance, without infantry support, without fuel or ammunition reserves, destroyed by German anti-tank guns that Soviet commanders had failed to suppress. By December 1941, the Soviets had lost approximately 20,000 tanks, many T-34s among them, catastrophic losses that would have destroyed any other nation's armoured forces. But Soviet industry replaced them, producing 3,000 T-34s in 1941, despite the chaos of invasion and evacuation. German officers studying the T-34 recommended copying it directly. A commission led by General Inspektor der Panzertruppen reviewed the design in November 1941, concluded that it was superior to any German tank, recommended that Germany cease producing existing models and manufacture T-34s under license with minor modifications to suit German preferences. The proposal was rejected for reasons that were partly practical. German factories were not equipped to produce the T-34's components, retooling would take years, and partly ideological, Hitler and other Nazi leaders refused to accept that German engineering needed Soviet improvements, that the master race required lessons from Slavic Untermenschen. This decision, driven by pride and racism, forced Germany to develop new tanks, rather than copying a proven design, costing time and resources Germany could not spare. The winter of 1941-42 vindicated the T-34's design in ways its creators had not fully anticipated. Soviet winter was the most severe in decades, temperatures dropping to -40 Celsius, conditions that paralyzed German forces equipped for European weather. German tank engines refused to start, their gasoline freezing in fuel lines, their oil turning to sludge. German tanks that did start found their narrow tracks sinking into snow, immobilizing them, making them targets for Soviet forces that moved freely on skis and sleds. The T-34's diesel engine, less affected by cold, started more reliably. Its wide tracks provided mobility in snow that German tanks could not match. Soviet tankers learned to light fires under their engines before starting, to add gasoline to diesel fuel to improve cold weather starting, to operate in conditions that would have grounded German armour completely. The T-34's battlefield signature was distinctive and terrifying to German infantry. The diesel engine produced a characteristic rattle at idle, a sound completely different from gasoline engines' smoother note. German soldiers learned to identify approaching T-34s by sound alone, would call for anti-tank support, would retreat from positions they knew could not withstand tank assault. The psychological effect was compounded by the T-34's appearance. Low silhouette, sloped armour giving it an aggressive profile, tracks that clanked ominously on frozen ground. German infantry coined numerous nicknames for it, most unprintable, reflecting fear and respect in equal measure. Soviet crews developed their own relationship with the T-34, complicated mixture of pride and frustration. The tank's mechanical reliability was good by Soviet standards, terrible by German ones. Transmissions typically lasted 200 to 300 hours before requiring rebuild or replacement, compared to 1,000 hours for German tanks. The clutch and brake steering system was difficult to operate, requiring significant physical strength, exhausting drivers who often needed relief after short periods. The interior was cramped, uncomfortable, poorly ventilated, filling with fumes from the diesel engine and smoke from the gun. Visibility was limited, the driver having only a narrow slit, the commander having a single periscope in the early models. Yet Soviet crews loved their tanks because they worked, because they could fight and survive, because they provided mobility and firepower that infantry lacked. One Soviet tank ace, Lieutenant Dmitry Lavrinenko, demonstrated the T-34's potential in experienced hands. Commanding a T-34 of the 1st Guards Tank Brigade, Lavrinenko destroyed 52 German tanks between October and December 1941, becoming the highest-scoring Soviet tank ace in the shortest period. His success resulted from superior tactics, understanding his tank's strengths and German weaknesses, using mobility to flank, using the 76mm gun's range to engage before German tanks could respond, using terrain to maximize protection from the sloped armor. Lavrinenko was killed in January 1942, not by German fire but by Soviet artillery hitting his tank during a confused engagement, friendly fire tragedy that illustrated the chaos of Eastern Front combat. His record stood as proof that in capable hands the T-34 was the most lethal tank in the world. The German counteroffensive in spring and summer 1942 revealed both T-34's strengths and Soviet tactical weaknesses. The drive towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields involved massive armoured battles where hundreds of tanks clashed across open steppe. German tanks, now including upgunned Panzer IVs that could challenge T-34s, employed sophisticated tactics, combined arms coordination, artillery and air support that multiplied their effectiveness. Soviet forces, still suffering from leadership purges and inadequate training, often fought bravely but incompetently, sending T-34s forward without reconnaissance, without coordinated fire plans, without adequate support. The results were predictable. German forces destroyed Soviet armour in overwhelming numbers, advanced hundreds of kilometres, seemed poised to win the war despite T-34 technical superiority. The Battle of Stalingrad marked a turning point, not because of any single engagement, but because it represented Soviet learning curve's inflection point. By late 1942, Soviet commanders had accumulated 2 years of combat experience, had studied German tactics, had developed doctrines that exploited T-34 capabilities while minimizing vulnerabilities. The tank corps, large formations of concentrated armour, replaced the earlier fragmented deployment. Massed T-34 attacks, hundreds of tanks advancing simultaneously, overwhelmed German defences through sheer weight of numbers, accepting casualties but achieving breakthroughs. Infantry-tank coordination improved, infantry suppressing German anti-tank guns, protecting tanks' vulnerable sides and rear. Artillery and tank cooperation was refined, preparatory barrages disrupting German defensive positions before tanks advanced. Operation Uranus, the the Soviet counteroffensive that encircled the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad in November 1942, demonstrated evolved Soviet capabilities. The T-34s of the 26th Tank Corps penetrated Romanian defensive lines, exploiting weakness on the German flanks, racing deep into the rear to link up with other Soviet forces, completing the encirclement before German armour could respond. The operation succeeded partly through surprise, partly through concentration of forces at decisive points, but also because T-34 mobility and protection allowed Soviet commanders to take operational risks that would have been suicidal with lesser tanks. German attempts to break the encirclement, Operation Winter Storm in December, were defeated partly by weather, partly by determined Soviet resistance, but critically by massed T-34 formations that stopped German armoured spearheads through attrition warfare that favoured Soviet numerical superiority. The T-34 model 1943 incorporated lessons from 2 years of combat. The two-man turret, identified as critical weakness, was replaced with a larger 3-man turret mounting an 85mm gun, the T-34-85 variant that would become the definitive version. The 85mm gun could penetrate the new German heavy tanks, the Tiger and Panther, under favourable conditions, while being lethal to all medium tanks. The third crewman, a dedicated loader, restored fire rate and freed the commander to command, dramatically improving combat effectiveness. The new turret was larger, allowing better optics, better ergonomics, better crew efficiency. These improvements came at a cost. The T-34-85 weighed 32 tons versus 26 for the original, reducing mobility slightly, but the trade-off was worthwhile. German intelligence assessments of the T-34 evolved from dismissive to respectful to deeply concerned. A report from Army Group Center dated March 1943 analysed T-34 capabilities in detail, concluding that it remained superior to standard German tanks in firepower, protection, and mobility, that only the new Tiger and Panther could match it, that those new tanks were scarce and mechanically unreliable while T-34s were numerous and proven. The report recommended avoiding tank versus tank engagements when possible, using anti-tank guns and artillery instead, exploiting German advantages in combined arms coordination, rather than accepting fights where T-34 technical superiority would tell. This defensive mindset was remarkable transformation from the aggressive confidence of 1941. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, became the ultimate test of T-34 capabilities. German forces assembled approximately 780,000 men, 2,700 tanks and assault guns, 2,000 aircraft for an offensive designed to encircle and destroy Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. The attack included substantial numbers of new Tigers and Panthers, German armour's best, alongside upgraded Panzer IIIs and IVs. Soviet forces defending Kursk deployed approximately 300,000 men, 3,600 tanks, 2,900 aircraft, more than half the tanks being T-34s in various configurations. The Soviets had intelligence warning of the attack, had prepared deep defensive belts, minefields, anti-tank positions, artillery concentrations, turning the salient into a killing ground. The fighting at Kursk demonstrated that massed T-34s, properly employed with adequate support, could stop German offensives regardless of German technical improvements. At Prokhorovka, on July 12th, approximately 500 T-34s attacked 200 German tanks, including substantial numbers of Tigers and Panthers in the largest tank engagement of the battle. The fighting was chaotic and brutal, tanks engaging at point-blank range where T-34 guns could penetrate even Tiger armour, German advantages in long-range gunnery and armour protection negated by close combat. Soviet losses were severe, perhaps 235 T-34s destroyed, but German losses, approximately 75 tanks, were irreplaceable given Germany's limited industrial capacity. The exchange ratio favoured Germany tactically, but the Soviets strategically. They could replace losses, Germany could not. Kursk marked the permanent transfer of initiative to Soviet forces. After July 1943, Germany never again launched a strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. From Kursk forward, Soviet forces advanced relentlessly westward, liberating occupied territory, pushing toward Germany itself, their advance spearheaded by T-34s that had become symbols of Soviet military power. The tank that German officers had mocked in early encounters had become the instrument of Germany's defeat, not through individual superiority. German Tigers and Panthers were arguably better tanks in technical terms, but through availability, reliability, and adequate performance across all combat parameters. The industrial comparison was stark and decisive. Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panthers and 300 Tigers during the war, magnificent machines that were complex, expensive, difficult to maintain, requiring extensive training to operate effectively. The Soviet Union produced approximately 57,000 T-34s in all variants, adequate machines that were simple, cheap, easy to maintain, operable by crews with minimal training. In a war of attrition, where industrial capacity and manpower reserves determined outcomes, the T-34's approach proved superior. German tanks were engineering masterpieces that required perfect conditions to perform optimally. T-34s were engineering compromises that performed adequately under any conditions, exactly what total war required. The T-34's influence extended beyond the Eastern Front. After Stalingrad, the Soviets began supplying T-34s to communist partisans and Allied forces. Poland's First Army, formed from Polish communists and Soviet-trained officers, fielded T-34s in the liberation of Poland. Czech and Yugoslav partisan formations received T-34s, using them against German occupation forces. After Germany's defeat, T-34 production continued, the tank being supplied to Soviet client states, forming the backbone of Warsaw Pact armour for decades. The Chinese copied the design, producing their own variant, the Type 58, used in Korean War and supplied to North Vietnam. The T-34 became the most widely produced tank in history, over 84,000 manufactured between 1940 and 1958, serving in conflicts on every continent. German veterans interviewed after the war universally acknowledged the T-34's impact. General von Mellenthin, who served throughout the Eastern Front campaigns, wrote that the T-34 was the finest tank design of the war, superior to anything Germany fielded until the Panther, and even the Panther merely matched rather than exceeded T-34 capabilities in most parameters. He noted that German technical superiority in 1941 was illusory, based on fighting obsolete Soviet equipment, while the T-34 was being introduced gradually. Had the Soviets concentrated T-34 production earlier, had they delayed war until 1942 when they would have had thousands rather than hundreds, the initial German advance might have been stopped cold at the frontier. The T-34's greatest weakness remained crew training and tactical employment. Throughout the war, Soviet tank losses were catastrophic by Western standards, sometimes exceeding 10-1 against German forces, sometimes reaching 1-for-1 when Soviets had numerical superiority. These loss rates reflected persistent weaknesses in Soviet combined arms coordination, in crew training, in maintenance and logistics. But Soviet industry and manpower allowed absorption of these losses. Germany, fighting a multi-front war with limited resources, could not trade tanks and trained crews at even ratios with Soviets who had more of both. The mathematics were brutal and deterministic. Soviet T-34 production in 1943 alone exceeded total German tank production for the entire war. This industrial supremacy, enabled by the T-34's design optimization for mass production, determined the war's outcome more certainly than any tactical innovation or operational brilliance. The T-34's design philosophy influenced post-war tank development globally. The emphasis on sloped armour became universal. Every subsequent tank design incorporated angling to maximize protection. The concept of good enough technical performance combined with production efficiency influenced NATO and Warsaw Pact designs. The understanding that crew ergonomics and visibility mattered as much as armour and guns shaped turret designs for decades. Even American tank design, previously emphasizing speed and mechanical reliability over protection, shifted towards Soviet-influenced concepts after analyzing T-34 combat performance. At the Soviet Armored Forces Museum in Kubinka, a T-34 model 1940 sits preserved as national monument, one of the earliest production examples, veteran of combat near Moscow in winter 1941. Its armour shows impact scars from German anti-tank rounds that failed to penetrate, dents and gouges that testify to survivability that saved its crew. The museum placard lists technical specifications and battle honours, but the real story is told by the tank itself. Low hull, sloped armour, wide tracks, long gun barrel, All elements combined into a design that was revolutionary in 1941 and remained formidable in 1945. German engineers who examined captured T-34s were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about design philosophy and engineering priorities. German tanks were optimized for crew comfort, sophisticated fire control, mechanical precision, assumptions that crew quality would be high, maintenance would be meticulous, combat would be decisive campaigns rather than prolonged attrition. These assumptions were valid for the Wehrmacht of 1939 but invalid for total war against Soviet Union. The T-34 was optimized for opposite assumptions. Crews would have minimal training, maintenance would be crude field repairs, combat would be sustained attrition where availability mattered more than individual superiority. Soviet designers had correctly understood their nation's capabilities and limitations, had created a weapon that played to Soviet strengths in industrial capacity and manpower, while minimizing dependence on factors where Soviets were weak, like precision manufacturing and extensive training programs. The T-34's combat debut caught German forces at their moment of maximum confidence and exposed vulnerabilities they had not known existed. In June 1941, the Wehrmacht seemed invincible, having conquered most of Europe in campaigns that validated every assumption about German military superiority. The Panzer III and IV had proven adequate against all opposition. German tactics, training, and leadership had consistently defeated numerically superior enemies. The invasion of Soviet Union was expected to be the crowning achievement, the final campaign that would secure German domination of Europe. Then German tankers encountered T-34s and discovered that their guns could not penetrate, their armour could not protect, their vaunted technical superiority was built on fighting obsolete opposition. The psychological shock manifested in multiple ways. Frontline units filed increasingly desperate reports requesting better anti-tank weapons, larger guns, heavier armour. Rear echelon officers, insulated from combat realities, dismissed these reports as exaggeration or cowardice. The disconnect between frontline experience and high command understanding persisted for months, during which German tankers died in obsolete Panzer IIIs facing T-34s they could not hurt. When senior officers like Guderian personally encountered T-34s and confirmed their superiority, the institutional response was panic, followed by crash development programs that consumed resources Germany could not spare while failing to produce timely solutions. The Tiger and Panther tanks, Germany's answer to the T-34, exemplified the problem with German design philosophy. The Tiger I, entering service in late 1942, mounted an 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at any range, was protected by armour up to 100mm thick that was impervious to most anti-tank weapons. It was a magnificent tank, possibly the most formidable tank of the war in pure combat capability. It was also mechanically complex, prone to breakdown, difficult to maintain, requiring extensive crew training, consuming enormous amounts of fuel. Each Tiger cost approximately 250,000 Reichsmarks and required 300,000 man-hours to build. Germany produced 1,347 Tigers total. The Soviet Union produced approximately 35,000 T-34s in the same period at roughly one-fifth the cost per tank. The mathematics were unforgiving. 5 T-34s cost less than 1 Tiger to produce. In combat, 5 T-34s could usually destroy 1 Tiger through massed fire and flanking attacks, making the Tiger a losing proposition despite its individual superiority. The Panther, designed specifically to counter the T-34, borrowed its sloped armour concept, but implemented it with German thoroughness that made the tank complex and expensive. The Panther's 75mm gun could penetrate the T-34's armour at any combat range. Its sloped frontal armour was nearly impenetrable to the T-34's 76mm gun. It was faster, more accurate, better equipped than the T-34. It was also mechanically unreliable, particularly early production versions which suffered from transmission failures, engine fires, and suspension problems. Panthers frequently broke down during the approach to combat, required extensive maintenance after each operation, consumed fuel at rates that strained German logistics. The Panther was a better tank than the T-34 in almost every measurable parameter, except the ones that mattered most: reliability, production efficiency, and availability. Soviet tankers who fought against Tigers and Panthers developed healthy respect for their capabilities, but understood that German technical superiority was strategically irrelevant. Lieutenant Alexander Fedin, who commanded a T-34-85 through the final year of the war, recalled encountering a Tiger near Kursk. The German tank destroyed 2 T-34s from his platoon before Fedin managed a flank shot that penetrated the Tiger's side armour. His observation was pragmatic. The Tiger was formidable, but we had 10 tanks to their 1. We could afford to lose 2 or 3 destroying each Tiger. They could not afford to lose Tigers at all. This understanding of attrition mathematics pervaded Soviet tactical thinking, acceptance that Soviet tanks and crews were expendable resources to be traded for victory, a brutal calculus that worked because Soviet industrial and manpower reserves could sustain losses that would have crippled Germany. The Eastern Front tank battles from 1943 onward demonstrated this attrition dynamic repeatedly. At Kursk, Soviet forces absorbed catastrophic losses but held their ground, the defensive belts absorbing German attacks, the massed T-34 counterattacks disrupting German momentum. At Korsun-Cherkasy in early 1944, Soviet tank forces encircled and destroyed 2 German corps, losing hundreds of T-34s but destroying German forces that could not be replaced. During Operation Bagration in summer 1944, the Soviet destruction of Army Group Center, T-34 formations provided the mobile striking power, racing through German rear areas, encircling strong points, advancing faster than German forces could retreat. The T-34 was not winning these battles through individual superiority, but through availability. Soviet commanders could commit armor, knowing that losses would be replaced. German commanders had to husband their scarce tanks, limiting their operational flexibility. The T-34's diesel engine, initially viewed as simply practical choice for fuel availability and fire resistance, proved to have strategic implications German planners had not anticipated. Diesel fuel was easier to refine than high-octane gasoline, requiring less sophisticated refinery equipment, producible in quantities that Soviet industry could sustain even under wartime conditions. German gasoline shortages became critical from 1943 onward, limiting training, restricting operations, forcing tactical choices driven by fuel availability rather than operational opportunity. Soviet T-34 units, while never having abundant fuel, maintained operational capability longer into campaigns, their diesel engines stretching available supplies further than German gasoline engines could. The crew survival rate in T-34s versus German tanks revealed another subtle advantage. When German tanks were penetrated, gasoline fuel and ammunition created catastrophic fires that killed entire crews. The Panzer III and IV were notorious for brewing up, tankers' slang for explosive destruction. The T-34's diesel was less flammable, providing crew slightly better survival odds when the tank was hit. Soviet tankers who survived their tank being destroyed were valuable assets, experienced crews who could be assigned new tanks and returned to combat quickly. German tankers killed in their burning Panzers were irreplaceable losses, their training and experience gone. Over thousands of engagements this survival differential accumulated, giving Soviets a marginal advantage in retaining experienced crews that Germany could not match. The T-34's production dispersal across multiple factories created resilience that German planners had not anticipated. When Germany concentrated tank production in large sophisticated factories, those facilities became targets for strategic bombing that disrupted production. Soviet practice of distributing T-34 production across dozens of facilities, from major plants to small workshops producing components, created a production network that was difficult to disrupt. Allied bombing of Germany from 1943 onward increasingly targeted tank factories, reducing German production. Soviet tank production, mostly beyond German bomber range and dispersed across the Urals and Siberia, continued uninterrupted. By 1944, Soviet T-34 production exceeded German production of all tank types, combined by factors of 3 to 1 or greater. The simplicity of T-34 maintenance was force multiplier German logistics could not match. A T-34 could be field repaired by crew with basic tools and minimal training. Transmission replacement, the most common major repair, required approximately 8 hours with a field crane. German tanks required specialized tools, trained mechanics, rear area workshop facilities for similar repairs. Soviet tank brigades included integral repair units with mobile workshops, allowing battlefield recovery and repair of damaged T-34s. German tank divisions relied on rear area repair depots, meaning damaged tanks had to be transported long distances, were out of action for extended periods, were sometimes lost entirely when retreat prevented recovery. The T-34's design for maintainability translated into higher operational availability, more tanks ready for combat at any given moment. Soviet tactics evolved to exploit the T-34's characteristics while minimizing its weaknesses. Deep battle doctrine, developed by Soviet theorists in the 1930s, emphasized penetration of enemy lines followed by rapid exploitation into the rear areas, exactly what the T-34's mobility enabled. Tank armies, large formations of concentrated armor, provided the mass necessary to overwhelm German defenses. The coordination of T-34 attacks with infantry, artillery and air power created combined arms effectiveness that negated many German tactical advantages. By 1944, Soviet operational art had matured to the point where T-34 formations were employed with sophistication, matching or exceeding German practices, the student having surpassed the teacher through bitter experience and institutional learning. German attempts to counter the T-34 through tactical innovation had limited success. Ambush tactics using concealed anti-tank guns achieved local successes, but could not stop operational level advances. Concentrating armor to achieve local superiority worked when fuel and operational circumstances allowed, but became increasingly difficult as German forces were stretched across multiple fronts. The defensive doctrine emphasizing strong points and counterattacks required mobile reserves that Germany no longer possessed in adequate numbers. By 1944, German forces on the Eastern Front were fighting a losing defensive campaign, trading space for time, conducting fighting retreats that delayed but could not prevent Soviet advances. The T-34's role in the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany cannot be overstated. It provided the Red Army with a weapon that was adequate against anything Germany fielded while being available in quantities that overwhelmed German forces. It enabled operational mobility that allowed Soviet forces to conduct encirclements and deep penetrations. It survived in conditions that immobilized German armor. It could be produced by Soviet industry and maintained by Soviet logistics. It could be operated by minimally trained crews and still achieve battlefield effectiveness. These characteristics collectively made the T-34 the right tank at the right time for the Soviet Union's needs, a weapon system that matched national capabilities to strategic requirements. The German failure to either copy the T-34 directly or develop effective counters earlier reflected institutional and ideological blindness. German military culture emphasized technological sophistication and engineering excellence, viewing weapons design as an arena where German superiority was obvious and unchallengeable. Accepting that Soviet engineers had created a superior tank required acknowledging that Slavs, classified as racial inferiors by Nazi ideology, could outthink Germans in technical domains. This acknowledgement was psychologically and ideologically impossible for many German officers and officials, leading to delays in recognizing the problem and implementing solutions. By the time German industry fielded tanks that could match the T-34, the strategic situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. The industrial balance had shifted decisively against Germany, and tactical improvements could not compensate for strategic collapse. The T-34 in Soviet propaganda and national identity became symbol of technological achievement and military prowess. Soviet citizens were told that their engineers and workers had created the world's best tank, had outthought and outbuilt the Germans, had provided the Red Army with weapons to defeat fascism. This narrative, while simplified and exaggerated, contained substantial truth. The T-34 was a genuine achievement, a tank that combined innovation and practicality in proportions that served Soviet needs perfectly. Its success validated Soviet industrial planning, vindicated the emphasis on heavy industry during the pre-war 5-year plans, demonstrated that Soviet socialism could compete with and defeat German capitalism in total war. Western Allied assessments of the T-34 were mixed. British and American intelligence recognized its capabilities, acknowledged its impact on the Eastern Front, but also noted its deficiencies in crew ergonomics, mechanical refinement, and fire control compared to Western tanks. The Sherman tank, America's primary medium tank, was inferior to the T-34 in armor and gunpowder, but superior in reliability, crew comfort, and ease of maintenance. British tanks were generally inferior to both, but emphasised crew survivability and mechanical reliability. Each nation designed tanks reflecting their priorities, capabilities, and tactical doctrines. The T-34 reflected Soviet priorities, adequacy across all parameters, optimization for mass production, acceptance of crew hardship in exchange for combat effectiveness. Lend-Lease supplies from the United States and Britain to the Soviet Union included many categories but relatively few tanks. Soviets received approximately 7,000 Allied tanks during the war, mostly Shermans and British models, a small fraction of the 57,000 T-34s Soviet industry produced. Soviet tankers who operated Lend-Lease tanks generally appreciated their reliability and crew comfort, but missed the T-34's superior armour and firepower. The T-34 remained the preferred tank for Soviet crews, familiar, trusted, adequate for the missions assigned. Western tanks were used when available, but never replaced the T-34 as the primary Soviet armoured vehicle. Post-war analysis by military historians and armour experts consistently rated the T-34 as one of the most influential weapon systems of World War II. Its impact on German operational planning, its role in Soviet offensives, its influence on subsequent tank design, all mark it as historically significant. Whether it was the best tank of the war remains debated, with advocates for the German Panther, the American Sherman, and the T-34 each making valid arguments based on different criteria. What is undebatable is that the T-34 was the most important tank of the war, the weapon that most directly contributed to Allied victory in the most important theatre, the Eastern Front, where 80% of German casualties occurred. The T-34's service continued long after World War II ended. Soviet forces used T-34s in the final operations against Japan in August 1945, where they faced minimal opposition and demonstrated effectiveness against fortifications. Chinese Communist forces used T-34s during the Chinese Civil War and later in Korea, where American M26 Pershing and M46 Patton tanks proved superior in tank versus tank combat, but where T-34 availability and numbers compensated for individual inferiority. North Vietnamese forces used T-34s during the Vietnam War, though by then the tank was obsolete, outmatched by American armour and anti-tank weapons. The T-34's final combat use occurred in the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, over 50 years after, its design, testimony to its ruggedness and longevity. Museums worldwide preserve T-34s as historical artefacts and memorials. The tank has been memorialized in films, books, and monuments throughout the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. In Russia, the T-34 remains symbol of Soviet sacrifice and victory in what Russians call the Great Patriotic War, the desperate struggle against Nazi Germany that cost the Soviet Union approximately 27 million dead. Veterans who served in T-34s are honoured as heroes, their service in defence of the motherland celebrated as ultimate patriotic sacrifice. The technical lessons of the T-34 influenced Cold War tank development profoundly. The Soviet T-54 and T-55, post-war designs that became the most widely produced tanks in history, with over 100,000 built, inherited the T-34's design philosophy, sloped armour, good enough performance, optimization for mass production. NATO tanks, particularly the American M48 and M60 series, incorporated lessons learned from analysing T-34 combat performance, emphasising sloped armour, powerful guns, balance between protection and mobility. The modern main battle tank concept, a vehicle that combines firepower, protection, and mobility in a package optimised for combined arms warfare, traces its lineage directly to the T-34. German veterans, interviewed decades after the war, consistently acknowledged that encountering the T-34 was a pivotal moment, a realisation that assumptions about German superiority were wrong, that the war was not going to be the easy campaign they had anticipated. Otto Carius, a Tiger tank commander and one of Germany's highest-scoring tank aces with over 150 kills, wrote in his memoirs that the T-34 was a rude awakening for German forces, a tank that forced Germans to fight defensively, to avoid engagements where T-34 numbers would overwhelm German tactical skill. He noted that destroying T-34s was possible, but that Soviet willingness to accept casualties made each German victory Pyrrhic, trading kills that Germany could not afford for losses the Soviets could absorb indefinitely. The evolution of the T-34 from 1940 to 1945 illustrated Soviet capacity for practical improvement based on combat experience. The original Model 1940 was revolutionary but flawed, its two-man turret being the most critical deficiency. The Model 1941 incorporated minor improvements, better transmission, improved optics, standardized production techniques. The Model 1942 simplified production further, accepting crude welding and finish to maximize output. The Model 1943 introduced the 85mm gun and three-man turret, transforming combat effectiveness. Each iteration reflected lessons learned, improvements that addressed identified weaknesses, while maintaining the core characteristics that made the tank effective. This evolutionary approach contrasted with German practice of introducing entirely new designs, each optimized to perfection, but requiring extensive development time and complicated production. The human cost of T-34 operations was staggering and rarely acknowledged in Soviet accounts. Crew survival rates were poor, the confined interior and ammunition, storage making penetration usually fatal. Training casualties were high, inexperienced crews making fatal mistakes. Mechanical failures killed crews through carbon monoxide poisoning from diesel fumes in poorly ventilated compartments, through fires from fuel leaks, through accidents during operations. The Soviet system treated tank crews as expendable, accepting casualties that Western armies would have found intolerable, driving operations with ruthless disregard for losses when strategic objectives required it. This callousness was partly cultural, reflecting Russian historical acceptance of sacrifice for collective goals, partly ideological, communist doctrine subordinating individual life to state needs, partly practical, the reality that total war against Nazi Germany required accepting casualties or facing defeat and extermination. Soviet women served in T-34 crews in small numbers, a practice unique among major combatants. Maria Oktyabrskaya, whose husband was killed fighting Germans, sold her possessions to purchase a T-34, donated it to the Red Army with the stipulation that she would serve as its driver. She fought from October 1943 until March 1944, when she was killed attempting to repair her tank under fire. Alexandra Samusenko commanded a T-34 company, leading from the front, earning multiple decorations before being killed in action in 1945. These women proved that T-34 operation required skill and courage, but not masculine strength, that the tank's design was accessible to anyone with training and determination. Their service challenged assumptions about women in combat, demonstrated Soviet willingness to utilize all available human resources in total war. The T-34's impact on German strategy extended beyond tactical considerations to operational and strategic levels. The realization that German armor was inadequate forced diversion of resources to tank development and production, resources taken from other critical needs like aircraft and U-boats. The concentration of German armor on the Eastern Front to counter T-34 mass meant fewer Panzers available in North Africa and Italy, contributing to German defeats in those theatres. The defensive posture forced on German forces by T-34 numbers prevented offensive operations that might have changed outcomes elsewhere. The T-34, simply by existing in quantities Germany could not match, constrained German strategic options and contributed to strategic overextension that doomed the Third Reich. The mythology surrounding the T-34 sometimes obscures its real achievements and limitations. Soviet propaganda portrayed it as invincible, the ultimate weapon that crushed fascism through inherent superiority. Western Cold War assessments sometimes dismissed it as crude and primitive, inferior to Western designs, successful only through numbers. The reality was more nuanced. The T-34 was an excellent tank that was good enough across all critical parameters, while being optimized for production and employment under Soviet conditions. It was not invincible. German forces destroyed tens of thousands. It was not primitive. Its design incorporated sophisticated engineering solutions. It was not successful solely through numbers, though numbers certainly mattered. It was successful because it matched weapon characteristics to strategic requirements better than any competitor, because Soviet designers understood what their nation needed and delivered it. The legacy of the T-34 endures in modern Russian military culture and identity. When modern Russian forces parade through Red Square on Victory Day, T-34s participate alongside contemporary armour, symbols of continuity between Soviet victory and modern Russian military. When Russian leaders speak of the Great Patriotic War, they invoke the T-34 as emblem of Soviet determination and capability. The tank has transcended its role as weapon system to become cultural icon, representing Russian resilience, technical prowess, and historical memory of suffering and ultimate triumph over Nazi Germany. Standing before a preserved T-34, one can understand both its revolutionary impact and its limitations. The low silhouette, meant to reduce target profile, created cramped interior that made crew operations difficult. The sloped armour, revolutionary in 1940, became standard practice by 1945, copied by all subsequent designs. The 76mm gun, devastating in 1941, was barely adequate by 1944 against improved German armour. The wide tracks, crucial for mobility in mud and snow, required maintenance that Soviet logistics struggled to provide. Every design choice represented a compromise, optimization for Soviet conditions and capabilities, acceptance that perfection was impossible and adequacy was sufficient. The T-34 entered combat in June 1941 when German forces expected easy victory over technologically inferior opponents. It exited the war in August 1945 as symbol of Soviet military-industrial might, having participated in every major operation on the Eastern Front, having been produced in quantities that overwhelmed German capacity to counter. In between, it evolved from revolutionary surprise to proven weapon to obsolescent design kept in production because Soviet industry had optimized for its manufacture. Through all these phases it remained effective enough, available enough, reliable enough to accomplish its mission, which was enabling Soviet victory in the most destructive war in human history. The Germans laughed at the T-34 initially because it contradicted their assumptions about Soviet capabilities, because its crude finish and simple design seemed to confirm prejudices about Slavic backwardness. They stopped laughing when their Panzer IIIs could not penetrate its armour, when their tanks were destroyed at ranges they thought safe, when they realised that technical sophistication was less important than adequate performance in mass. The laughter turned to respect, then to fear, as T-34s appeared in ever greater numbers, as Soviet tactics improved, as the tide of war turned irreversibly against Germany. By 1945, no German tanker laughed at the T-34. They respected it, feared it, and understood that it represented a design philosophy they had failed to counter, a weapon system that had crushed German armour through a combination of adequacy, availability, and ruthless employment that accepted casualties Germany could not match. The thunder of T-34 diesel engines and the crack of 76mm guns became the sound of Soviet victory, mechanical symphony that accompanied the Red Army's advance from Stalingrad to Berlin, crushing everything in its path.